During the Cold War, intelligence archives were treated as weapons. Every report, every operational note, every name on paper carried strategic value long after an operation ended. For the United States, destroying an intelligence archive was never routine. It meant something inside those files was more dangerous preserved than erased. The operation directed against the KGB that would later be partially destroyed was not a single mission, but a long-term intelligence campaign. It stretched across years, involved multiple CIA departments, and relied on a combination of human intelligence, psychological profiling, and indirect penetration attempts. Its purpose was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice: to map the internal logic of Soviet counterintelligence. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the CIA had accepted that direct penetration of the KGB was extremely rare. Recruitment attempts inside the BIM Soviet security apparatus often ended in failure or compromise. Instead, American intelligence shifted toward a different goal. Rather than stealing secrets, it sought to understand how the KGB thought, reacted, and adapted. Patterns mattered more than documents. The operation relied heavily on controlled exposure. The CIA deliberately allowed certain activities to be noticed by Soviet counterintelligence. Low-level assets, false leads, and carefully constructed signals were introduced into the Soviet system. The goal was not to deceive the KGB, but to observe how it responded. Which units reacted first? How quickly internal security tightened? What behavioral changes followed inside the organization? Over time, the CIA began to build a behavioral model of the KGB. This model did not list names or positions. It described tendencies, risk thresholds, institutional paranoia, the balance between ideology and pragmatism. It was one of the most sensitive analytical projects of the Cold War, because it attempted to predict not actions, but reactions. This is where the danger emerged. As the operation expanded, it accumulated vast amounts of meta-intelligence. Not just what the KGB did, but how the CIA learned to manipulate visibility itself. The archive documented methods of controlled failure, intentional exposure, and psychological provocation. It revealed not only Soviet vulnerabilities, but American doctrine in its rawest form. By the late Cold War period, parts of the archive had become obsolete operationally, but explosive politically. They showed how close certain maneuvers had come to triggering counterintelligence escalations. They documented cases where misinterpretation could have led to arrests, purges, or diplomatic crises. Most importantly, they revealed how much of the Cold War intelligence battle relied on mutual paranoia rather than concrete threats. When the Cold War ended, American intelligence faced a dilemma. Declassification was expected. Historical transparency became policy. But some archives could not survive exposure, not because they revealed crimes, but because they revealed fragility. They showed how intelligence agencies on both sides often operated in uncertainty, improvisation, and fear. Destroying parts of the archive was not an act of concealment alone. It was an act of damage control. The files did not just document an operation against the KGB. They documented how easily intelligence systems could misread each other, and how close that misreading came to irreversible consequences. The question was no longer what the CIA had done to the KGB. It was what the archive revealed about the limits of intelligence itself. And that was something the United States was not prepared to leave on record. As the Cold War moved into its final decades, the CIA's operation against the KGB entered a phase that few outside senior intelligence circles fully understood. The focus shifted away from active engagement and toward long-term analytical exploitation. By this point, the CIA was no longer trying to outmaneuver Soviet counterintelligence directly. It was studying the consequences of visibility itself. What happened when the KGB believed it had detected something, even when nothing concrete existed? This phase of the operation produced the most sensitive material in the archive. Analysts began documenting not only Soviet responses, but American decision-making during moments of uncertainty. Internal debates were recorded in detail. Memos revealed disagreements over how much pressure could safely be applied without provoking irreversible escalation. Some officers argued that controlled exposure sharpened understanding. Others warned that the margin for error was dangerously thin. What made the archive uniquely dangerous was its honesty. It did not present the CIA as omniscient or fully in control. It documented confusion, miscalculations, and near failures. In several cases, Soviet counterintelligence reactions were faster and more aggressive than predicted. Surveillance intensified. Internal KGB structures shifted unexpectedly. In at least one instance, American analysts believe their actions may have contributed indirectly to a harsh internal Soviet security response whose full consequences were never confirmed. These uncertainties created unease at the highest levels of U.S. intelligence leadership. The archive no longer represented a record of success. It represented a map of risk. It showed how experimental intelligence strategies could produce outcomes that were impossible to fully predict or contain. Worse, it revealed that both sides often reacted to assumptions rather than facts. As détente collapsed and tensions flared again in the early 1980s, the operation was quietly scaled back, not officially terminated but frozen. The flow of new material slowed. Analysts were instructed to reassess long-term implications rather than pursue further interaction. The archive, however, remained intact, growing heavier with unresolved questions. Inside the CIA, access to the files became increasingly restricted. The material crossed boundaries between operational intelligence, strategic theory, and political sensitivity. It touched on allied cooperation, diplomatic signaling, and moments where intelligence actions overlapped dangerously. With military posture, the archive was no longer about the KGB alone. It was about how intelligence behavior shaped global stability. When political winds shifted near the end of the Cold War, pressure mounted to prepare intelligence records for eventual review. Congressional oversight increased. Declassification frameworks expanded. Historians and policymakers began demanding clarity about Cold War operations. This is when the archive became a liability. Some documents could be sanitized, others could not. Entire analytical sections depended on context that could not be explained without revealing methods or exposing the fragile logic behind them. More troubling still, parts of the archive showed how close intelligence experimentation had come to reinforcing paranoia on both sides. The concern was not embarrassment. It was misinterpretation, released without proper context. The files could suggest intentional provocation or reckless manipulation. They could undermine trust in intelligence institutions at a moment when post-Cold War stability depended on transparency and restraint. The idea of destruction began quietly, not as an order but as a question. What value did these records serve now? And what risk did they pose if they survived? By the time the discussion reached senior leadership, the answer was no longer about history. It was about containment. Some knowledge, once recorded, could outlive the conditions that made it understandable. And in the wrong hands, or the wrong era, it could become dangerous all over again. By the late 1980s, the archive had become a silent problem no one wanted to formally acknowledge. It existed in a gray zone between history and liability. Operationally, the CIA no longer needed it. Strategically, it was too revealing to ignore. The Cold War was approaching its end. But the logic embedded in the files belonged to a far more dangerous world, one defined by secrecy, escalation, and mutual fear. What troubled senior intelligence officials was not the success or failure of the operation against the KGB, but the pattern it revealed. The archive showed how intelligence agencies, on both sides, often reacted to perceived intent rather than verified action. Entire analytical chains were built on assumptions. Signals were interpreted through expectation. In several documented cases, Soviet counterintelligence responses escalated because American analysts believed escalation was likely. The cycle reinforced itself. This feedback loop was never meant to be visible. Within the archive were internal CIA assessments, acknowledging that some methods blurred the line between observation and provocation. Analysts debated whether deliberately allowing the KGB to notice certain activities had unintentionally increased Soviet internal pressure. There were moments where the CIA could not determine whether KGB reactions were defensive, corrective, or preparatory. The distinction mattered and was often unclear. As the Soviet Union began to weaken politically and economically, the archive became even more sensitive. A new reality was emerging, one in which former adversaries might eventually examine each other's records. Intelligence leaders understood that files, written for internal analysis, could later be read as evidence of intent. Nuance would be lost. Context would vanish. What remained on paper could be misread as deliberate manipulation. The archive also contained something more dangerous than methods or assessments. It contained doubt. Doubt about control. Doubt about predictability. Doubt about whether intelligence experimentation had always increased security rather than risk. These doubts were not meant for public consumption. They challenged the image of rational mastery that intelligence institutions projected. As discussions intensified, a divide emerged within the CIA. Some argued that history demanded preservation. Future analysts, they believed, needed to see mistakes as well as successes. Others countered that the Cold War archive was not a neutral record. It was a product of extreme conditions. Preserving it without the lived experience of that era could distort its meaning. Quietly, portions of the archive were reclassified at even higher levels. Access was narrowed. Review committees were formed, not to evaluate operational relevance, but to assess long-term risk. The central question was no longer what the archive revealed about the KGB. It was what it revealed about American intelligence behavior under pressure. One internal memo captured the concern bluntly. The archive documented processes that should not become precedents. It showed how far intelligence agencies might go when driven by fear of the unknown. It revealed how easily theoretical models could become operational habits. By this stage, destruction was no longer framed as erasure. It was framed as containment. The idea was not to hide wrongdoing, but to prevent misinterpretation across generations. Intelligence leaders feared that future readers, detached from Cold War realities, might see recklessness where there had been caution, or intent where there had been uncertainty. The irony was unavoidable, an archive created to understand. The KGB had become a mirror reflecting the limits of American intelligence itself. Preserving that mirror posed a risk no one could fully calculate. And so the question that dominated internal discussions was not whether the archive should survive, but whether it was ever meant to. As the Cold War formally ended, the archive entered its most dangerous phase, transition. Intelligence systems built for confrontation were now expected to coexist with diplomacy, openness, and historical review. What had once been protected by secrecy was now vulnerable to reinterpretation. The CIA faced a paradox. The very records that demonstrated analytical sophistication also revealed how fragile stability had been. During internal reviews, analysts noticed something unsettling. Many conclusions in the archive were correct only within the emotional and political atmosphere of their time. Remove the fear, and the logic became questionable. What once looked like cautious probing could later resemble provocation. What once appeared defensive could be read as manipulation. The archive required context that could not be archived. Another concern emerged quietly but persistently: reciprocity. As relations with post-Soviet Russia evolved, intelligence cooperation, formal or informal, became possible. That raised an unspoken risk. If American archives were opened, pressure would follow to open others. The CIA understood that some records, if mirrored by foreign disclosures, could revive distrust instead of burying it. The archive also intersected with Allied intelligence. Portions referenced joint assessments, shared methodologies, and collaborative experiments in counterintelligence analysis. Declassifying such material would not only expose American thinking, but also implicate partners who had never consented to public scrutiny. What began as an operation against the KGB had expanded into a web of international intelligence practice. As review committees worked through the files, patterns became clear. Certain sections offered historical value without operational danger. Others were inseparable from living methods, and some were neither. They documented intellectual processes, how analysts reasoned under uncertainty, how models were tested against real-world reactions. These were the most troubling. They could inspire imitation without understanding. Senior leadership feared that future intelligence officers, reading these documents, might see experimentation as endorsement. The Cold War had rewarded boldness under pressure. A different era might interpret that boldness without appreciating the risks that had constrained it. The archive risked becoming a manual divorced from consequence. The decision to destroy parts of the archive was therefore fragmented. No single order erased everything. Committees authorized selective removal. Analytical appendices vanished. Internal debates were stripped out. Cross-referenced models were broken apart so they could no longer be reconstructed. What remained was a skeletal record, events without the thinking that produced them. This approach satisfied no one fully. Historians would later notice gaps. Analysts would sense something missing. But the alternative, preserving a complete record, was judged more dangerous. Intelligence leadership concluded that some knowledge was too situational to survive its context. The destruction was conducted quietly and methodically. No announcement followed. No acknowledgement was made. Officially, routine archival management had occurred. Unofficially, a line had been drawn between what could be remembered and what had to be forgotten. The irony endured. An operation designed to understand the KGB had ended by revealing how much intelligence depended on fear, assumption, and improvisation. Preserving that revelation threatened to outlive the conditions that had made it true. By erasing parts of the archive, the United States was not denying history. It was choosing which lessons history would be allowed to teach. and that choice carried consequences that would only become clear much later. The destruction of the archive did not erase the operation. It erased certainty. What remained were fragments, references without context, conclusions without the reasoning that produced them. To outsiders, this looked like concealment. Inside the intelligence community, it was understood as something else: risk management after the fact. The United States did not destroy the archive because the operation against the KGB had failed, nor because it had succeeded too well. It was destroyed because it documented a form of intelligence work that no longer had a safe place in history. The files revealed how close analytical experimentation had come to shaping reality rather than observing it. They showed how assumptions could harden into signals, and how signals could provoke reactions that then appeared to confirm the original assumptions. This circular logic was the archive's most dangerous legacy. For decades, intelligence agencies had operated under the belief that more information meant more control. The archive challenged that belief. It showed that interpretation mattered more than volume, and that misinterpretation could scale faster than correction. In several instances, analysts acknowledged that they could not distinguish between Soviet reaction and Soviet anticipation. The difference was invisible and critical. When historians later asked why records were missing, official explanations were procedural: routine disposal, redundancy, classification conflicts. None of these were entirely false, but none captured the deeper reason. The archive threatened to expose how much of the Cold War intelligence struggle had been driven by imagined futures rather than present facts. There was also a moral dimension that remained unspoken. The files documented moments where analysts suspected that their actions may have intensified internal pressure within the Soviet system. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but predictably. The archive did not accuse, it questioned, and questions were harder to contain than accusations. By choosing destruction, the United States accepted an uncomfortable trade-off. It preserved institutional stability at the cost of historical completeness. It prevented future misreadings, while ensuring that some lessons would never be fully learned. The decision reflected a belief that intelligence history, if misunderstood, could become operational again. The Cold War ended without the archive being judged in public. No tribunal weighed its contents. No consensus formed around its meaning. Instead, silence settled where analysis had once lived. That silence was not empty. It was intentional. What survived were simplified narratives: victory, defeat, deterrence, restraint. The more fragile truths about doubt, improvisation, and near mistakes were left undocumented. The archive had contained those truths, and that was precisely why it could not remain intact. In the end, the question was never why the United States destroyed the archive of its operation against the KGB. The real question was what that archive revealed about intelligence itself. It showed that the most dangerous weapon was not secrecy, but belief. Belief that systems were rational. Belief that reactions were predictable. Belief that information could be controlled once released. The archive was destroyed because it contradicted those beliefs, and in doing so, it left behind a final lesson, unwritten but enduring. Intelligence does not fail only when it is wrong. It fails when it believes its interpretations are reality. That lesson survived the archive. Everything else was allowed to disappear.